lot of new operas don't get the orchestra rehearsal before the actual stage rehearsals begin. So here we're having the orchestra rehearsal with a little time to make some changes before. It's fantastic to be able to have this chance to do that. But my reaction on hearing things, it's a little disorienting, honestly, as the composer, because we've had a number of workshops and heard all of the material and had chances to develop it and change it and all of that, but it's always been with piano. And so now the first time you're hearing it that I'm hearing it with the orchestra, it's a very different thing and slightly surreal in a way, because you're hearing something that you kind of know and something that you imagined, and some things sound as you thought and better than you thought even, and some things sound like, oh, that's not what I was hoping for. It's an interesting thing because it's definitely part of the whole process of working on the piece, being able to hear it in this way and then respond.
I think the orchestra's having a really good time with it. It's probably also one of the first examples of an opera where there's a basketball game and a foul shot, and he misses the foul shot, and then the good guy makes it. It's probably the first example of an opera where there are people picking their nose, and the various discussions about that. Booger, 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 booger. And so in that sense, it's very eclectic, and there's also a little bit of music theater in there as well. I mean, it's a potpourri of musical sounds, and it's a whole new sound world that Doug has created. And so, in that sense, I think there's a little bit for everyone in there. You know, it's not a type of opera. It's not a type of music that moves along on one track and stays there the entire time. Obviously, this is true, I think, definitely because we're living in 2012. And there's such a barrage of information that's being bombarded at us every second of the day. And Doug lives in New York, which is, of course, a mayhem of experience. This music can't but reflect that in some way. When Doug and I first talked about writing an opera, as an interpretive musician, you're dealing with something that's already printed. And so it's your job to reproduce faithfully what that person has written, as an actor would lines that have been written for them. And so in this case, a composer is sitting in front of a blank page, and so, and especially nowadays, where there's such a vast variety of music that's being written out there. You know, you think about composers. I mean, I live in Italy, so I'm sort of concentrating on the Italian repertoire. But people write an opera and wrote an opera back in the day in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. You know, do you want it good, or do you want it tomorrow? Do you want it next week? When does it need to be done? But they were dealing with a very particular set of rules and regulations on how an opera was to be structured. And so, because today the form of opera has blown wide open, we talked about sort of at the beginning, how do you construct the architecture also of a scene with music and words and text? In this case, the libretto was already existent. So he had to organize the scenes in a musical sense that would make an overall structure somehow decipherable to a listening audience. And I think he's done that very successfully, also because he's thought about using the orchestra in a way, I'm saying in a Wagnerian way, not obviously in a harmonic sense, but in the sense that I just touch on Wagner because he's the type of composer that used the orchestra as the Greek chorus in that sense. And so in those types of works, when the orchestra plays a motive, automatically the audience understands what's going on in that particular moment. It's almost like it's an underlying motive to subconsciously tell us what the characters maybe even are thinking. And so these little motives that maybe you're hearing in the orchestra are designed to not only give an overall structure to the piece, but also to make sort of dramatic sense out of it. It's a very tense and nervous energy that this piece is about, and I think the overall sound that he's been able to create has very successfully mirrored that sort of dark and anxious sound that maybe reading the play or watching the movie, if any of you have seen the movie, would probably be your first impression in that sense. So in the orchestra, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I would say the orchestra workshop has changed the direction that we're headed a lot. I mean, it certainly supports the choices we've already made, but it makes me see the piece in a different light, and it's very Doug Cuomo. I mean, everything I've always loved about his music, that kind of jazzy American quality, has infiltrated the entire piece. There's all this great stuff with the brass and the strings and the percussion that I hoped it would sound like this in a way, because I've been a fan of Doug's music for so long. But it's hard to tell when you're listening to a piano reduction in a vocal workshop what the orchestra is going to actually sound like. So the whole piece is coming to life in my head in a new way that's very exciting and unexpected.
He is that reformed post-Vatican II priest who so desperately wanted to embrace the church community, so desperately wanted an inclusive church, a church that reached out in the same vein that Jesus taught us to do this in all of the Gospels, that he was a loving Christ, and this wasn't a separation of what was going on in the rectory and the rest of the congregation, that this was somebody who wanted to do the Mass in English, that wanted to sit in front of people and play the guitar and teach about love. And then he gets accused of this most heinous, heinous, heinous crime. And who knows? Who knows?
Absolutely. I'm all the way in. I've got both feet in the water. I'm excited. I'm really, really looking forward to it. And I have a great amount of compassion for this woman, Mrs. Miller, and understanding the complexity of the dynamics in her life and all that she has to manage, and how it's about taking the list of all the evils, I guess, you know, that she has to contend with, and just what it's like to be, you know, a woman and to be the heart of the family, to keep the family together, to keep peace and some sort of harmony with your spouse, and to make sure that your child is well balanced, and to do the best that you can under the circumstances, which are very heavy for her at that time.
In working on this character, it would be very easy to make Sister Aloysius always harsh and always mean. But I think if I go that route, it becomes too much of a one-dimensional kind of character. And I think her strictness with the children, I think her suspicions about Father Flynn come from a place of love for the children. Sometimes when I'm working on a character, I try to think of somebody who maybe reminds me of her. And there's an older woman in the town where I live who was a kindergarten teacher for, I don't know, 50 years maybe. And everybody was afraid of her. I mean, I was afraid of her. I'm still afraid of her when I see her. She's 97, and just the way she says things, you know, I need to speak to you about your daughter, she said to me one Sunday before church started. And so I had the whole church service to sit and think, what did my daughter do? I mean, she gave me troubles in high school, when she was in high school, but she was in college then. Well, it turned out that this woman wrote letters to every student from our town who went away to college. And she said in 40 years, only two students had written back, and my daughter was one of them. But even the way she said it to me, it made me sort of sit up and take notice. And so I think this woman is always driven by love for children, but she sets high expectations for children. And I think Sister Aloysius does this too. When she's observing the class and the kids are, oh, why do we need to know history? You do need to know this. I'm hoping that I can do this, an undercurrent of love for the children and for their welfare and for their good well-being, that they become, you know, good citizens, that they know history, that they don't goof off. And so that's sort of the approach I'm taking, and hopefully I can accomplish that.
Well, in the past I've written a lot of music for television, some music for film, and lots of various different kinds of things. The most notable was probably the theme from Sex and the City, which I wrote. And I scored a bunch of those episodes as well. People often ask, you know, how does that process and that compare to writing, you know, a concert piece or an opera even? While in some sense I have the same musical aesthetic, the process is very different, and also the result is often very different. In the television and film world, it's much more, you're much more focused and kind of directed. So your choices are much narrower. Whereas in an opera, you're sort of leading the way as the composer. So it's, for me, it's no comparison in terms of how exciting and interesting and daunting it is to be doing an opera compared to all of those other kinds of works.
My brother and I saw Doubt when it was on tour, the play. And we left that theater, and my brother and I had debates for probably 2-3 days, maybe a week, on whether or not Father Flynn did what he was accused of. And I think that is obviously the most defining characteristic of this Father Flynn is people don't know, hence the title of this piece. I mean, gosh, I don't know, I have no idea. And, you know, and that's me. I'm performing the role.
In the name of the Father, of the Son, and the Holy Ghost.